December 17, 1944, Belgium, the Ardennes Forest. The morphine hadn't fully taken hold yet, so Oberstabsarzt Klaus Brenner could still feel the jagged edges of his femur grinding against each other with every breath. The pain arrived in waves, white-hot surges that made his vision blur, and his teeth clenched so hard he thought they might shatter. He lay in the snow beside the overturned Kübelwagen, watching his own blood seep into the white powder, turning it the color of rust. Above him, the winter sky stretched colorless and indifferent. He had been a surgeon once, a good one. In Berlin, before the war consumed everything, he had saved lives with hands that never trembled. Now those same hands were caked in frozen mud and his own blood, useless appendages attached to a body that was rapidly becoming a corpse. The American shells had caught their convoy on a narrow forest road, 3 vehicles destroyed in as many minutes. Brenner had been thrown clear when the blast flipped the Kübelwagen, but his leg had caught between the chassis and a tree trunk. The bone had snapped with a sound like a dry branch breaking. Around him the snow was littered with bodies. Some moved. Most didn't. The winter air carried the familiar reek of cordite, burning rubber, and something else, something sweet and nauseating that Brenner's medical training identified as cauterized human flesh. He had smelled it countless times in field hospitals from Stalingrad to Normandy. He never thought he would be the source of it. Sanitator. Someone was crying weakly. Medic. But there were no medics left. Brenner had watched the young under a fissure, barely 20 years old, take shrapnel through the throat 10 minutes earlier. The boy had bled out in under 2 minutes, his hands scrabbling uselessly at the wound, his eyes wide with the terrible understanding that comes too late. Klaus Brenner was 43 years old. He had survived 4 years of war. He had survived the Eastern Front, where temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and men's fingers turned black and fell off like twigs. He had survived Normandy, where the American bombers had turned entire field hospitals into smoking craters. He had survived because he was careful, because he was skilled, because he believed in the righteousness of German medicine and German efficiency. Now he was going to die in a Belgian forest because his femoral artery was severed and there was no one left to apply a tourniquet properly. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent the last 3 years triaging wounded soldiers, deciding who would receive treatment and who would be left to die because resources were scarce and the Reich demanded efficiency above all else. He had made those decisions with clinical detachment, knowing that sentiment was a luxury Germany could not afford. The weak did not deserve to live if it meant wasting supplies that could save someone stronger, someone more valuable to the war effort. Now he was the weak one. Now he was the waste of resources. He could hear engines in the distance, American engines. He had learned to distinguish them from German ones by their smoother, more powerful sound. They were coming to secure the ambush site, to count their kills and collect their prisoners. If they came soon enough, he might survive. If they delayed even 20 minutes, he would bleed out. Brenner found himself praying, something he hadn't done since childhood. Not to God, whom he had long ago decided was either dead or indifferent, but to whatever impersonal force governed the universe. Let them come quickly. Let them not leave me here to freeze and bleed. Let them... The thought died unfinished because it required him to hope for mercy from the enemy. And everything Brenner had been taught, everything he had witnessed, everything he believed about the nature of war, told him that mercy was a myth. The Americans would come, yes. They would shoot the survivors who resisted. They would strip the dead of anything valuable. They would leave the wounded to die because that was what soldiers did. That was what he would have done. His vision was narrowing now, the edges going dark. The blood loss was accelerating. His body temperature was dropping. In his medical training, he had learned the stages of hemorrhagic shock. First, anxiety and increased heart rate. Second, confusion and decreased blood pressure. Third, organ failure. Fourth, death. He was somewhere between second and third, his mind floating in and out of clarity, his body shutting down systematically to preserve the core. He thought about his wife, Margaret, whom he hadn't seen in 18 months. He thought about his daughter, Anna, who would be 12 now, growing up in a bombed-out Berlin without a father. He thought about the hundreds of men he had treated, the hundreds more he had left to die, the moral calculus that had seemed so clear in theory and so unbearable in practice. The engine sounds were closer now, voices in English, harsh American vowels. Brenner tried to raise his head but couldn't. His body had stopped obeying him. He could only lie there staring at the gray sky, waiting for whatever came next. A face appeared above him, young, dirt-streaked, wearing an American helmet with a white circle and red cross painted on it. A medic. The American said something Brenner couldn't understand, then knelt beside him in the snow. Gloved hands pressed against his leg, applying pressure to the wound. Brenner gasped at the sudden spike of pain. This was it, then. This was where Klaus Brenner would die, in the hands of an enemy medic who would probably rob his corpse before moving on to the next body. But the American didn't move on. He stayed there, maintaining pressure, calling out orders to someone Brenner couldn't see. Within seconds, more Americans appeared, 2 of them carrying a stretcher. They moved with practiced efficiency, sliding boards under Brenner's body, strapping him down, lifting him with a smoothness that suggested extensive training. Brenner's last coherent thought before the morphine finally pulled him under was a simple, bewildering question that would reshape everything he thought he knew about war, about medicine, about the value of a human life. Why are they saving me? To understand the shock that would soon overwhelm Klaus Brenner and thousands of German medical personnel like him, one must first understand the world they came from, a world built on premises so different from American military medicine that the 2 systems existed almost in separate universes. German military medical doctrine in 1944 was the product of 2 decades of ideological conditioning and 4 years of total war. It was rooted in a philosophy that explicitly rejected the notion of universal human value. The Reich's medical establishment, thoroughly Nazified by this point in the war, operated on a principle of ruthless triage that went far beyond mere battlefield pragmatism. It was triage elevated to ideology. The numbers told the story. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht's medical supplies had dwindled to catastrophic levels. A German field hospital that would have stocked 300 liters of whole blood in 1941 now had perhaps 20 liters, and that was if they were lucky. Morphine was so scarce that it was reserved exclusively for officers. Enlisted men received at best a shot of schnapps before surgery. Often they received nothing at all. Brenner had learned to operate under these conditions. He had learned to amputate limbs without anesthesia, holding down screaming 18-year-old boys while he sawed through bone, with tools that were often improperly sterilized because they didn't have enough alcohol to disinfect them between patients. He had learned to make decisions in seconds. This man gets the antibiotics, this man doesn't. This man gets surgery, this man gets a dose of morphine and a quiet corner to die in. This man is worth saving, this man isn't. It wasn't cruelty, or rather it was cruelty made necessary by scarcity. That's what Brenner told himself. That's what they all told themselves. The Eastern Front had been the crucible where these practices were forged. In the winter of 1941 through 42, when the Wehrmacht had besieged Leningrad and pushed deep into Soviet territory, German medical units had faced casualties on a scale that made proper treatment impossible. Thousands of men with frostbite, wounds festering in the sub-zero temperatures, dysentery, typhus, trench foot. The hospitals couldn't handle the volume. Doctors made lists, literally written lists, of who would receive treatment and who would be left outside in the snow to die. Brenner remembered a specific incident from that winter. He had been stationed at a field hospital outside Rzhev, where the fighting had been particularly brutal. They had 400 wounded men and supplies for perhaps 100. He had gone through the wards with a clipboard, marking men with colored chalk. Green for treat immediately, yellow for treat if supplies permit, red for palliative care only. Red meant morphine if available, nothing if not. Red meant death. One man, Brenner still remembered his face, though he had forgotten his name, had grabbed his coat as he passed. The man's leg was black with gangrene up to the hip. Without amputation, he would die of sepsis within 2 days. But amputation required anesthesia they didn't have, surgical time they couldn't spare, antibiotics they needed for men with better chances of survival. "Please, Herr Doctor," the man had whispered, "please don't let me die like this." Brenner had marked him red and moved on. The man had died that night, screaming. Brenner had heard him from 3 wards away. That was war. That was medical reality. That was what every German doctor had learned to accept as not just necessary, but correct. The weak did not deserve to live if saving them meant wasting resources that could save the strong. It was Darwinism applied to battlefield medicine. It was efficiency. It was what separated professional military medicine from sentimental bleeding heart idealism. Klaus Brenner woke to the sound of a generator humming, not the irregular coughing sputter of the overtaxed German generators he was accustomed to, generators that ran on whatever fuel could be scrounged, that broke down constantly, that powered lights that flickered and died at crucial moments during surgery, but a steady, powerful thrumming that spoke of abundant fuel and proper maintenance. His leg was on fire. That was the first sensation that penetrated the morphine fog, not the grinding agony of before, but a different pain, sharper and more localized. Surgical pain. Someone had operated on him. He opened his eyes. The ceiling above him was canvas, a tent then, a field hospital. But the light was wrong. Instead of the dim, yellowish glow of kerosene lamps or the harsh shadows cast by a single hanging bulb, the space was illuminated by multiple electric lights, bright enough to read by, bright enough to perform surgery by. He could hear them humming softly, a sound that meant power to spare. Brenner turned his head, ignoring the spike of nausea the movement caused. He was in a ward with perhaps 20 other beds, all occupied. The tent was warm, genuinely warm, not the barely above freezing temperature he had grown accustomed to in German field hospitals, where fuel for heating was considered a luxury. Someone had strung the tent with what looked like electric heating elements. A man in the next bed was reading a magazine, reading, as if he were convalescing in a civilian hospital rather than a battlefield medical station. The man noticed Brenner looking and gave a small nod. His arm was in a cast, a proper plaster cast, not the improvised splints and bandages German medics made do with. "You're awake," the man said in German. His accent was American, clumsy but comprehensible. "Good. The doc said you'd probably wake up soon." Brenner tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. The American noticed and reached for something beside his bed, a metal cup. He held it to Brenner's lips. Water. Clean, cold water. Not the brackish, chemical-tasting stuff German soldiers drank from their canteens. "How long?" Brenner managed. "They brought you in yesterday afternoon. Surgery was about 6 hours ago. You're lucky. Another 20 minutes and you would have bled out. 6 hours ago." That meant they had operated on him almost immediately. No waiting, no triage list, no determination of whether he was worth the resources. They had simply saved him. "My leg?" "Still attached. They pinned the femur, stitched up the artery. Doc said you'll walk again, but it'll take a few months." Brenner closed his eyes. They had saved his leg. In a German hospital, with their limited supplies and overworked surgeons, they would have amputated without question. A shattered femur with arterial damage. Too complicated, too time-consuming. Too much risk of infection. Better to take the leg and move on to the next patient. He had made that exact decision dozens of times. But the Americans had pinned his femur. That required metal hardware, plates, screws, materials that Germany had long since diverted entirely to weapons manufacturing. It required X-ray equipment to properly align the bone. It required time, hours of surgical time with a dedicated team. It required post-operative care with antibiotics to prevent infection. All of this for an enemy prisoner, for a man who, by any rational calculation, was of zero value to the American war effort. Less than zero, he was a liability, a drain on resources, someone who would require feeding, housing, medical attention for months. The American in the next bed had gone back to his magazine. Brenner watched him for a moment, noting the casualness of his posture, the absence of the haunted, hollow-eyed look that characterized every German soldier Brenner had seen in the last 2 years. This man had been wounded seriously enough to be in a hospital, yet he looked comfortable, well-fed, clean. A medic walked past, a different one from the dirt-streaked young man who had first found Brenner in the snow. This one wore a clean uniform, had recently shaved, and carried a clipboard. He stopped at each bed, checking on patients, making notes. When he reached Brenner's bed, he smiled. "Awake? Good. How's the pain, on a scale of 1 to 10? Brenner stared at him. The medic was asking about pain levels, as if pain management were a priority, as if keeping patients comfortable mattered. 7, Brenner said, because it was true and because he didn't know what else to say. The medic made a note. "I'll get you something for that. We want to keep you ahead of the pain, not chasing it." He moved on to the next bed. "We want to keep you ahead of the pain." The phrase echoed in Brenner's mind. In German field hospitals, pain was expected, accepted, endured. Morphine was precious, reserved for the most extreme cases or for officers. The idea of proactively managing pain, of keeping patients comfortable as a goal in itself, was foreign. Brenner spent the next hour simply observing, trying to catalog everything that seemed wrong, everything that contradicted his understanding of military medicine. The observations accumulated like evidence in a trial, each one small but collectively overwhelming. The medic returned with morphine. Real morphine, not ersatz painkillers or watered-down doses. He administered it without hesitation, without checking a roster to see if Brenner had exceeded his allotment. 15 minutes later, a different medic came through with food. Hot food, a thick stew with actual meat in it, white bread, coffee. Real coffee, not the roasted grain substitute German soldiers had been drinking since 1942. The portions were generous, more than Brenner had eaten in a single meal in months. The tent itself was astonishing. It wasn't just warm and well lit. It was organized with an efficiency that suggested unlimited resources. Medical supplies were stacked neatly on shelves, boxes of bandages, bottles of antiseptic, surgical instruments gleaming in sterile containers. Everything was labeled. Everything had its place. There was no sense of scarcity, no careful rationing, no anxiety about running out. Around noon, a doctor came through on rounds. He was perhaps 50, with gray at his temples and the weathered look of someone who had seen extensive combat. His uniform was clean but worn, marked with the insignia of a major. He carried a chart and was accompanied by 2 younger medics who took notes as he examined each patient. When he reached Brenner's bed, he pulled up a stool and sat down, as if he had time to spare, as if Brenner weren't just one patient among hundreds who needed attention. "I'm Major Weinstein," the doctor said in flawless German. "I performed your surgery yesterday. How are you feeling?" "Alive," Brenner said. "Which surprises me." Weinstein smiled slightly. "That's the goal. Let me take a look at the leg." He pulled back the blanket and began unwrapping the bandages with gentle practiced movements. The wound beneath was clean, neatly stitched, showing no signs of infection. The skin around it had been shaved and disinfected so thoroughly it almost gleamed. "Looks good," Weinstein said. "No inflammation, no discharge. We'll keep you on sulfa for another week, then reassess. Sulfa drugs, sulfonamide antibiotics, the miracle medicine that had revolutionized the treatment of bacterial infections. Germany had them too, but in such limited quantities that they were reserved exclusively for SS officers and high-value personnel. Wehrmacht soldiers made do with whatever folk remedies could be improvised, if they received anything at all. "Why?" Brenner asked. Weinstein looked up from the bandages. "Why what? Why did you save me? Why didn't you just let me die? Or amputate? Why spend the resources, the time, the medicine on an enemy prisoner?" The question hung in the air between them. Weinstein finished rewrapping the bandages before he answered. "Because that's what we do," he said simply. "You were wounded. You needed surgery. We had the capability to help you. The rest doesn't matter. But I'm German. I'm your enemy. In a rational system, medicine isn't about systems, Weinstein interrupted. It's about people, individual human beings who are suffering and whom we have the ability to help. The oath I took didn't have an exception clause for enemy soldiers. Brenner wanted to argue, to point out the impossibility of sustaining such a philosophy in total war, to explain that sentiment was a luxury that led to defeat. But the words stuck in his throat because he was lying in a clean bed with a pinned femur and a belly full of hot food and enough morphine in his system to keep the pain at bay, all because these Americans had decided he was worth saving. "May I ask," Weinstein said, "what's your medical background? You have the bearing of a physician." "Oberstabsarzt," Brenner said, "senior medical officer. I was a surgeon in Berlin before the war. Thoracic surgery, primarily. Then you understand what goes into a procedure like the one I performed yesterday. The resources required, the time, the risk? Yes. Which is why I don't understand why you did it." Weinstein stood, preparing to move on to the next patient. "Maybe that's something worth thinking about while you recover. The difference between what you understand and what we practice might tell you something important about this war." He moved on, leaving Brenner to stare at the canvas ceiling and grapple with an impossible reality. Part 4, The Revelation, in boxes. 3 days later, Brenner witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had been moved to a different tent, one designated for ambulatory patients who were recovering but still required observation. His leg was healing remarkably well, the pain now manageable with minimal medication. He could sit up, could move himself to a wheelchair with assistance. The speed of his recovery was itself shocking. In German hospitals, patients with injuries like his typically spent weeks bedridden, often developing complications from immobility, bed sores, pneumonia, blood clots. Here, the medical staff had him moving within 48 hours, preventing those complications before they could develop. The tent where he now resided had a view of the supply area, a sprawling section of the camp where trucks arrived regularly with equipment and materials. Brenner had taken to watching the activity there, trying to understand the scale of the American medical operation. On the third day, he watched a truck arrive carrying wooden crates marked with red crosses. Medics unloaded the crates with the casual efficiency of men handling routine cargo. One of the crates slipped from someone's grip and broke open on the ground, spilling its contents. Boxes. Dozens of small cardboard boxes, each labeled in English. Brenner squinted, trying to read the writing from 50 feet away. Then one of the medics picked up a box and carried it toward Brenner's tent, presumably to restock the medical supplies there. As the medic passed, Brenner saw the label clearly. Plasma, dried, human, type O, for intravenous use. The medic noticed him staring. "Something wrong?" "That box," Brenner said in halting English. "What is it?" "Plasma. Dried blood plasma. You need me to show you?" Before Brenner could respond, the medic had opened one of the boxes and pulled out a glass bottle. Inside was a pale yellow powder. He also pulled out a separate bottle of sterile water and what looked like transfusion equipment. "See, it's brilliant," the medic said, warming to his subject with the enthusiasm of someone explaining a favorite tool. "We take the plasma, remove all the liquid, dry it into powder, weighs almost nothing, doesn't need refrigeration, lasts for months. Then when we need it, we just add sterile water, mix it up, and boom, you've got plasma ready for transfusion. We can literally carry 100 units on a single truck instead of 10. He demonstrated pouring the sterile water into the bottle with the powder, shaking it gently. Within seconds, the powder dissolved, creating a clear yellowish liquid indistinguishable from fresh plasma. 30 seconds from powder to transfusion, the medic said proudly. Saved hundreds of lives just in my unit alone. Brenner stared at the reconstituted plasma with an expression that must have looked strange because the medic asked, "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "A ghost? Yes." Brenner was seeing the ghost of every German soldier who had died in the last 3 years from hemorrhagic shock, from blood loss that could have been prevented if they'd had access to this technology. He was seeing the ghost of the 20-year-old Unteroffizier who had bled out in the Belgian snow while Brenner could do nothing but watch. He was seeing the ghosts of thousands upon thousands of men who had died not because their wounds were untreatable, but because Germany lacked the industrial capacity, the scientific infrastructure, the organizational sophistication to create something as simple and revolutionary as dried blood plasma. "How much?" Brenner asked. "How much do you have?" The medic shrugged. "I don't know the exact numbers. A lot. Every field hospital has it, every battalion aid station, every ambulance carries at least 10 units. We probably go through 1,000 units a week across the entire theater, and we never run out. The factories back home just keep making more. 1,000 units a week. Never running out." The numbers were so large, so far beyond German capabilities, that they seemed like fiction. Brenner thought of the Eastern Front again, of the winter of 1941. He thought of the field hospitals where men died of shock because there was no blood to give them, where doctors watched patients slip away because the blood they had was the wrong type, or had gone bad in storage, or simply didn't exist because the supply lines had broken down. He thought of how many of those men, tens of thousands certainly, could have been saved with something as simple as this powder in a box. The medic, oblivious to Brenner's spiraling thoughts, patted him on the shoulder. "Anyway, glad you're doing better. You were pretty rough when they brought you in." He walked off, leaving Brenner alone with the reconstituted plasma and the weight of revelation. On the 7th day of his captivity, though captivity seemed an increasingly inadequate word for his experience, Brenner was deemed well enough to leave his bed for extended periods. A medic provided him with crutches and gave him permission to move around the camp within certain boundaries. The medic had warned him not to overexert himself, but suggested that gentle movement would aid his recovery. What the medic didn't say, but what Brenner suspected, was that the Americans wanted him to see. They wanted him to observe their operation, to understand it. Whether this was intentional psychological warfare or simple American openness, Brenner couldn't determine, but he took advantage of it. He made his way slowly through the camp, his leg throbbing despite the pin and the medications, until he found what he was looking for: the surgical theater. It wasn't housed in a permanent structure, of course. This was still a field hospital, mobile and temporary. But the tent that served as the operating room was larger than any surgical tent Brenner had seen in the Wehrmacht. Outside it, a massive generator hummed steadily, feeding power to the lights inside. The tent's entrance was covered with thick canvas flaps to maintain a sterile environment. But there was a viewing area, a section of the tent with clear plastic windows where medical personnel could observe procedures for training purposes. Brenner positioned himself there, leaning heavily on his crutches, and watched. The surgery in progress was an abdominal wound, a young American soldier, barely 20, who had taken shrapnel in the lower intestine. In a German field hospital, this would have been a death sentence. Abdominal wounds required extensive surgery in sterile conditions with proper anesthesia, followed by weeks of careful postoperative care to prevent peritonitis. The resources required made such procedures prohibitively expensive in terms of time and materials. German doctrine was clear: stabilize, administer morphine, evacuate to a rear area hospital if possible. If evacuation wasn't possible, make the patient comfortable and let nature take its course. But here, in this canvas tent in Belgium, a full surgical team was working to save this young man's life. The team consisted of 5 people: a lead surgeon, an assistant surgeon, an anesthesiologist, and 2 surgical nurses. They moved with choreographed precision, each person knowing their role, each transition smooth and practiced. The lead surgeon, a different doctor than Weinstein, a younger man with steady hands and intense concentration, was working inside the abdominal cavity, carefully removing damaged tissue and repairing the perforated intestine. The lighting was extraordinary. Multiple overhead lamps, each powered by that humming generator, illuminated the surgical field with daylight intensity. There were no shadows, no dim corners, no need to work by flashlight or candle, as Brenner had done countless times in German field hospitals when the generators failed or the fuel ran out. The anesthesiologist monitored the patient's vital signs on actual equipment: a blood pressure cuff, a stethoscope, but also what looked like some kind of electronic monitoring device that Brenner didn't recognize. In German hospitals, anesthesia was often administered by a regular medic who simply tried to keep the patient unconscious without killing them. Here it was a dedicated specialty with its own trained personnel. The surgical instruments gleamed under the lights, properly sterilized, sharp, specialized. Brenner could see forceps, scalpels, retractors, suturing needles all laid out in organized trays. In German hospitals, instruments were used until they broke, sharpened until they couldn't be sharpened anymore, sterilized inadequately because there wasn't enough alcohol or heat available. But what struck Brenner most profoundly was the attitude of the surgical team. They worked with focus, yes, with professional intensity, but there was no panic, no sense of desperate urgency born from too many patients and too few resources. They took their time. When the lead surgeon needed a better angle, he adjusted his position and waited while the nurses repositioned the lights. When a bleeder proved difficult to clamp, he worked at it patiently until he got it right, rather than simply ligating the entire vessel to save time. This was surgery performed the way surgery was meant to be performed, carefully, thoroughly, with the patient's survival and recovery as the only consideration. Not surgery as triage, not surgery as a brutal calculation of resource allocation, but surgery as the pure practice of healing. The procedure lasted 3 hours. Brenner watched all of it, standing despite the pain in his leg, unable to look away. When it was finished, when the last suture was placed, and the wound was closed, and the young American soldier was wheeled to recovery, with a decent chance of survival, Brenner felt something crack inside his chest. He had been a surgeon, a good surgeon. He had trained for 7 years, had dedicated himself to the art and science of healing. He had taken the Hippocratic Oath, had sworn to do no harm, to treat the sick regardless of their station or status, and then he had spent 4 years betraying that oath in the name of efficiency and necessity and the demands of total war. He thought of all the men he had marked red, all the men he had turned away because they weren't worth the resources. All the men he had let die, not because their wounds were untreatable, but because treating them would have required time and materials that could be used on someone with a better chance of survival, or someone of higher rank, or someone more valuable to the Reich's continued prosecution of the war. He had convinced himself it was rational, necessary, the only way to operate under conditions of scarcity. And perhaps it had been necessary. Perhaps there had been no choice given German resource constraints and the scale of casualties and the relentless demands of the Eastern Front. But necessity wasn't the same as rightness. And watching this American surgical team spend 3 hours saving one young soldier's life, Brenner understood with crystalline clarity that there had been a choice all along. The choice wasn't between efficient triage and impractical idealism. The choice was between a system that valued human life and a system that valued other things more. Over the following days, Brenner's observations expanded. With his improving mobility came greater access to the American medical operation, and what he saw systematically dismantled every assumption he had held about military medicine. He saw the blood bank, an actual refrigerated facility powered by generators, stocked with hundreds of units of whole blood in addition to the dried plasma. The blood was typed, labeled, tracked with paperwork that ensured nothing was wasted or mixed up. In German hospitals, blood transfusions were ad hoc affairs. Find a donor with compatible blood. Hope they were healthy. Hope the transfusion didn't cause a reaction. Hope you didn't kill the donor by taking too much. He saw the pharmacy, shelves upon shelves of medications, morphine, sulfa drugs, quinine, aspirin, antiseptics, anesthetics, quantities that seemed impossible. A medic explained to him that supply ships arrived weekly from the United States, carrying tons of medical supplies. Weekly. The Germans received supply shipments monthly if they were lucky, quarterly in practical terms, and those supplies were often diverted to civilian hospitals or to SS units before the Wehrmacht saw them. He saw the X-ray equipment, portable units that could be set up in under an hour, allowing surgeons to see exactly what they were dealing with before they cut. German field hospitals had X-ray equipment too, theoretically, but it rarely worked, and the photographic plates were scarce. and getting the equipment to function required an electrical engineer who usually didn't exist. He saw the post-operative care, patients monitored continuously, infections caught early and treated aggressively, wounds cleaned and redressed daily with fresh bandages. In German hospitals, post-operative care meant checking on the patient once a day if you had time and hoping for the best. He saw the food, 3 meals a day, hot, nutritious, sufficient. Patients gained weight during recovery. In German hospitals, patients often lost weight even while being treated, their bodies struggling to heal on inadequate nutrition. But the most profound moment came when Brenner encountered another German prisoner, a young Oberarzt named Friedrich Weber, who had been captured 3 weeks earlier near Aachen. They met in what the Americans called the convalescent area, a section of the camp where recovering prisoners were allowed to socialize, read, even play cards under loose supervision. Weber was recovering from a shoulder wound that had been surgically repaired. He had been a military doctor, too, had served in a Wehrmacht field hospital in France. They spoke in German, 2 colleagues meeting under impossible circumstances. "Did you see the operating theater?" Weber asked after they had exchanged basic information about their captures and injuries. "Yes," Brenner said. "Then you understand." Weber's voice was quiet, almost reverential. I stood there for 2 hours watching them work, and I kept thinking, this is what we could have been. This is what medicine looks like when it's not corrupted. Corrupted, Brenner repeated. What else would you call it? What we did back there, the selections, the triage, the men we left to die because they weren't valuable enough. We told ourselves it was necessary, that we had no choice. But look at this. He gestured around the camp. They have choices. They have resources. And you know what they choose? They choose to save everyone they can. Everyone. Not just Americans. Not just officers. Everyone. It's easier when you have unlimited resources, Brenner said, but the argument felt hollow even as he made it. Is it about resources, Weber challenged, or is it about values? Yes, they have more supplies than we do. But I've talked to the medics here. I've asked questions. Do you know what their casualty survival rate is? For serious wounds reaching a field hospital? Brenner shook his head. 96%. 96% of American soldiers who reach a field hospital alive leave it alive. Do you know what ours was? What we achieved with our efficient triage and our rational resource allocation. Brenner knew, but he didn't want to say it. 73%, Weber said, 73% on a good month, sometimes as low as 60. We were so busy deciding who deserved to live that we forgot how to keep people alive. The number hit Brenner like a physical blow. He had never seen it stated so starkly, had never had the Wehrmacht survival rate compared directly to the American one. A 23 percentage point difference. That meant that for every 100 German soldiers who reached a field hospital alive, 23 more died than would have died in an American hospital. 23 men per 100. Across 4 years of war, across millions of wounded, that translated to hundreds of thousands of preventable deaths. Men who died not because their wounds were untreatable, but because the system they served had decided that saving them all was impossible or impractical or inefficient. The medic who treated me, Weber continued, was a kid from Iowa, 22 years old. He told me he joined the medical corps because he wanted to help people, not to serve his country, not to defeat the enemy, but to help people. Can you imagine a German medic saying that? Can you imagine our system selecting for people who just wanted to help? Brenner couldn't. The Wehrmacht Medical Corps selected for political reliability first, then technical competence, then ideological commitment. Compassion wasn't on the list of desired qualities. Compassion was weakness. They treated me, Weber said, the same way they treated their own. The same speed, the same care, the same resources. I was the enemy. I had been shooting at them 2 days before, and they saved my arm. He rotated his shoulder gingerly. The surgeon told me I'd regain about 80% mobility. 80%. In our hospital, they would have amputated and moved on. I know, Brenner said quietly. Do you? Do you really understand what that means? It means we were wrong, Klaus, not just strategically wrong or logistically wrong, morally wrong. We built a system that treated human beings as resources to be allocated rather than as lives to be saved. And we did it in the name of efficiency and necessity and winning the war. But look where it got us. He laughed bitterly. Losing the war and learning that the enemy we thought were soft and sentimental and weak because they valued human life. They're the ones winning. They're winning because they value human life. Klaus Brenner spent 6 weeks in the American Field Hospital before being transferred to a prisoner of war camp in France. During those 6 weeks, he kept a mental inventory of everything he observed, every detail that contradicted his previous understanding of military medicine, every moment that revealed the vast chasm between German and American approaches to treating the wounded. The inventory became a kind of obsession, a catalog of shame. Item: on his 12th day, he watched an American medic spend 45 minutes carefully cleaning and dressing the wound of a German SS prisoner who had shot at American soldiers from an ambush position. The medic's care was gentle, professional, identical to how he treated American soldiers. When Brenner asked him why, the medic looked confused by the question. "He's wounded," he said, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. Item: the hospital received a delivery of penicillin, the new wonder drug that was revolutionizing the treatment of bacterial infections. Germany knew about penicillin, had tried to develop it, but lacked the industrial capacity to mass produce it. The Americans had boxes of it, cases. They used it liberally, preventing infections before they started, rather than desperately fighting them after they took hold. Item: a young American soldier died despite the best efforts of the surgical team. Brenner watched the staff's reaction, genuine grief, a sense of failure despite having done everything possible. In German hospitals, death was expected, accepted, processed with bureaucratic efficiency. Here, every death was treated as a tragedy, evidence that the system had somehow failed rather than proof that war was brutal and soldiers died. Item: physical therapy. The Americans had dedicated personnel whose job was to help wounded soldiers regain function, to ensure they recovered not just to survival, but to the fullest possible mobility and capability. Brenner underwent it himself, exercises designed to strengthen his leg, to prevent muscle atrophy, to restore his ability to walk. In German hospitals, you recovered or you didn't. No one had time for rehabilitation. Item: mental state was monitored. Doctors asked not just about physical pain, but about emotional well-being, about nightmares, about mood. They had a term for it: battle fatigue. They treated it as a medical condition rather than as weakness or cowardice. German military medicine acknowledged physical wounds, but had no framework for psychological trauma beyond executing soldiers who couldn't continue fighting. Item: mail call. Even prisoners received letters if they had been cleared by censors. Brenner received 3 letters from his wife, forwarded through the Red Cross. The Americans made sure prisoners could maintain contact with families, could preserve some sense of connection to life beyond the war. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it spoke to a fundamental assumption about the value of maintaining the humanity of even enemy combatants. Each item on the inventory was a small revelation. Collectively, they formed a devastating indictment of everything Brenner had participated in, everything he had accepted as necessary, everything he had rationalized as the demands of total war. The breaking point came during his 4th week when he was allowed to visit other German prisoners in the camp. There he met Hauptmann Ernst Richter, who had been a medical administrator in Berlin before being conscripted. Richter was not wounded, but had been captured when his unit surrendered. He was angry, bitter, full of Nazi rhetoric about American decadence and the eventual German victory. "They're soft," Richter declared to a small group of prisoners. "Look at how they waste resources on prisoners, on the wounded who can't fight again. They lack the will to do what's necessary. That's why we'll win eventually. We understand that war requires hard choices." Brenner listened to this and felt something inside him finally break. He stood, awkwardly leaning on his crutches, and faced Richter. "Hard choices," he said quietly. "Is that what we call it? Hard choices?" "Yes," Richter said. "The Americans don't have the stomach for—" I was a surgeon, Brenner interrupted. 4 years, 3 fronts. I made your hard choices. I decided who lived and who died. I marked men for death because we didn't have enough supplies, enough time, enough beds. And do you know what I learned making those hard choices? The group had gone quiet watching him. I learned that we were wrong. Not just strategically wrong. Not just because we were losing the war. Wrong in a fundamental way that I didn't even have the vocabulary to express until I ended up here. He gestured around the camp. The Americans treat every wounded soldier as a human being worth saving, not a resource to be allocated, not a unit to be processed, a human being. And their survival rate is 96%. Ours was 73. 23 more men per 100 died in our hospitals because we were making hard choices. That's just numbers, Richter said dismissively. Statistics can be manipulated. I watched a young medic spend an hour cleaning and bandaging the wound of an SS officer who had killed American soldiers, Brenner continued, his voice rising. An hour. On an enemy prisoner. Because his job was to heal wounds, not to judge whether the wounded deserved healing. And I realized that this wasn't weakness. It was strength. It was civilization. It was everything we claimed to be fighting for, but had actually destroyed in ourselves. You sound like you've been brainwashed, Richter said. No, Brenner said. I sound like someone who's finally seeing clearly. We told ourselves that sentiment was weakness, that compassion was a luxury, that valuing human life was impractical. We built an entire medical system on those principles. And it was inferior, not just morally, though yes, morally it was monstrous, but medically, scientifically. We achieved worse outcomes because we were so focused on efficiency that we forgot the purpose of medicine. He sat back down, exhausted from the outburst. Some of the prisoners looked uncomfortable. Others looked thoughtful. Richter stormed away, muttering about defeatism, but Weber, the young Oberarzt, nodded slowly. I've been thinking the same thing, he said. We were taught that the Reich represented the pinnacle of scientific and medical achievement, superior in every way. But we weren't superior, we were just cruel. And we called the cruelty strength. The war in Europe ended 5 months after Klaus Brenner's capture. By then, he had been transferred to a larger POW camp in France, where he worked in the camp hospital, an irony not lost on him, treating fellow German prisoners under the supervision of American medical officers. The camp hospital was better equipped than most Wehrmacht field hospitals had been. The Americans ensured adequate supplies, proper sanitation, and reasonable standards of care, even for prisoners. Brenner worked under the direction of Captain James Morrison, a family physician from Pennsylvania, who treated his German medical staff with professional respect, despite the circumstances. Working in that hospital, Brenner began to practice medicine the way he had been trained originally, before the war, before the compromises and the triage and the hard choices. He treated every patient as someone worth saving. He took time with examinations. He advocated for resources when patients needed them. And he found that he was good at it, perhaps better than he had been before, because now he understood what he had lost and what he was reclaiming. When Germany surrendered, the camp administrator gathered all the prisoners and informed them that they would be repatriated as soon as logistics allowed. The process would take months, perhaps a year. In the meantime, they would continue working, maintaining the camp, providing labor for reconstruction efforts. Brenner was given a choice: return to Germany immediately with the first wave of repatriations, or remain in France to continue working in the hospital. He chose to stay. Germany was rubble and chaos. His skills were needed here. And if he was honest with himself, he wasn't ready to face what Germany had become. He stayed for 14 months, working in the camp hospital, then in a civilian hospital in Lyon that was desperate for doctors regardless of their nationality. During that time, he wrote letters to his wife, trying to explain what he had experienced, what he had learned, what he had become. The letters were inadequate. How could he compress such a profound transformation into words on paper? But he tried. In late 1946, he finally returned to Berlin. The city was divided, occupied, physically and spiritually destroyed. His wife and daughter had survived, living in a cramped apartment in the British sector. They had endured bombing, starvation, and the Soviet occupation. They looked at him as if he were a stranger, and perhaps he was. His daughter, Anna, was 14 now. She asked him what he had done during the war. He told her the truth, or as much of it as a 14-year-old could process. He told her about the triage, the men he had left to die, the system he had served. And then he told her about the American hospital, about the medic from Iowa who had saved his life, about the surgical team that had spent 3 hours saving one young soldier, about the dried blood plasma and the penicillin, and the fundamental difference between a system that valued life and a system that valued other things. Were we the bad ones? Anna asked. In the war? Brenner thought about that question for a long time before answering. The world is more complicated than good and bad, he finally said. But yes, in many ways, we were. Not because every German was evil, but because we built systems that treated human beings as expendable. And we convinced ourselves it was necessary. He worked for the rest of his life as a physician in Berlin. He never spoke publicly about his experiences. The wounds were too fresh, the shame too deep. But he became known among his colleagues as a doctor who never gave up on a patient, who advocated fiercely for resources, who treated every person in his care with dignity regardless of their circumstances. Friedrich Weber, the young Oberarzt he had met in the American hospital, became a professor of medicine in Hamburg. In 1963, he published a paper titled Medical Ethics in Extremity: Lessons from Wartime Practice. The paper carefully avoided explicit political statements, but examined how resource scarcity affected medical decision-making and how different systems approached the value of human life. It became required reading in German medical schools. The two men corresponded occasionally over the years. In one letter written in 1968, Weber wrote, "I sometimes wonder if we learned the lesson too late. The Americans showed us that you could value life and still win wars, that compassion wasn't weakness, but strength. We learned it in defeat. I hope the next generation learns it without needing the kind of shock we experienced." In 1979, Klaus Brenner was invited to speak at a medical conference in West Berlin on the topic of battlefield medicine. He was 78 years old, near the end of his life. He almost declined. He had spent 3 decades avoiding public discussion of his wartime experiences. But something about the invitation, about the possibility of finally articulating what he had learned, compelled him to accept. He stood before an audience of young doctors and medical students, most of whom had been born after the war, and told them his story. He told them about the winter of 1944, about bleeding in the Belgian snow, about expecting to die and instead being saved. He told them about the American field hospital, about the dried plasma and the surgical theater and the medic from Iowa who spent an hour on a single bandage. And then he told them what it had meant. The Americans won the war for many reasons, he said: superior resources, industrial capacity, strategic position. But there was something else, something I didn't understand until I experienced it firsthand. They won because they believed that every human life had value. Not as propaganda, not as rhetoric, but as practice, as daily, operational reality. He paused, looking out at the young faces. We told ourselves that sentiment was weakness, that compassion was a luxury, that hard choices required us to see human beings as resources to be allocated efficiently, and perhaps, given our circumstances, some of those choices were necessary. But necessity doesn't make something right. And I spent the rest of my life understanding the difference. The lesson I learned in that American hospital wasn't about medical technique or resource management. It was about what happens to medicine, what happens to humanity, when you start treating life as expendable. You don't just become less moral, you become less effective. Because medicine is ultimately about believing that every patient is worth saving. Once you lose that belief, once you start calculating who deserves treatment and who doesn't, you're no longer practicing medicine, you're practicing something else. He finished by telling them about the young American soldier whose abdominal surgery he had watched, the 3-hour procedure to save one life. I learned more about medicine in those 3 hours than in 4 years of wartime practice, he said. I learned that the purpose of being a doctor isn't to manage scarce resources or make efficient decisions about who lives and who dies. It's to fight for every life as if that life were the only thing that mattered, because in that moment, it is. Klaus Brenner died 6 months later. His obituary in the medical journal noted his distinguished career and his contributions to thoracic surgery. It made only brief mention of his wartime service. But among those who heard him speak that day, among the students and young doctors who listened to an old man describe his transformation in an American field hospital 35 years earlier, his words echoed. They understood what he was really telling them, that the measure of a civilization isn't in its strength or efficiency or willingness to make hard choices, but in its treatment of the wounded, the vulnerable, the enemy. That medicine, practiced properly, is an act of defiant compassion in a world that often demands calculation instead. That some revelations come too late to change the past, but never too late to transform the future. And that sometimes it takes defeat, capture, and the shocking mercy of strangers to teach us what we should have known all along, that every human being is worth saving, and that any system built on a different premise is fundamentally broken, no matter how efficient it claims to be.